what you got. Let me spit my corn.
Heavy D was working on a book before he died. Kim Porter was working on a book before she died. And Al B. Sure was working on the documentary of his life.
You know, they have poisons that create heart attack and pneumonia-like symptoms.
They told us it was natural, a medical complication. Just bad timing. Boots something about Heavy D's death never sat right, because when you look at Thiedemann, who he was around, and what he was working on before it happened, the story starts to change. He had just stepped back into the spotlight, just given the Kindoff performance. People don't forget that in a matter of days, he was gone.
And hip-hop pioneer Heavy D died last night.
There were whispers, of course, quiet once, about pressure, about silence, about Thepris of stepping away, and suddenly Thepipole, closest to one of music's biggest empires, started disappearing until Hugh was the last man standing. Was it all just coincidence? Or is there something much deeper we've all been missing? Something they don't want you to ask about. Something they really don't want you to know. They told us it was a pulmonary embolism, sudden blood clot in the lungs. Just a random medical tragedy after a long flight. That's the official story they gave us, when Heavy D, one of the most beloved, joyful, and unproblematic figures in hip-hop, was found collapsed outside his Beverly Hills condo in November 2011. But when you take a closer look at the circumstances surrounding his death, the timing, the people, the patterns, that story starts to unravel, and what's left behind is a trail of secrets, silence, and some very disturbing questions. Just before his death, Heavy D had performed in London for a Michael Jackson tribute concert, his first live show in 15 years. It was supposed to be his big comeback. He was getting love from fans again. Weeks earlier, he shut down the BET Hip Hop Awards with a powerful medley of his biggest hits, beaming with joy, smiling, dancing, glowing. But within days of that triumphant return, he was gone. According to the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, Heavy D died from a pulmonary embolism, likely caused by deep vein thrombosis, a blood clot that formed during his long flight back from London. They noted he also suffered from heart disease and reportedly had pneumonia, though the coroner claimed it didn't contribute to his death. There was also cough syrup in his system, but, again, not enough to matter. That was the official version, clean, clinical, logical. But for many who knew him or even just followed the industry, none of it sat right. Not the suddenness, not the timing, not the eerie similarities to what had happened to other artists connected to Uptown Records.
Heavy D was working on a book before he died. Kim Porter was working on a book before she died. And Al B. Sure was working on the documentary of his life.
At the time of his death, Heavy D was allegedly working on a Tello book, something that might have exposed major players in the industry, including Diddy. And if that sounds like speculation, consider this. Andre Harrell, the founder of Uptown Records, who gave Heavy D his start, he also died of a heart attack. Kim Porter, Diddy's ex and longtime confidant, dead. She had pneumonia-like symptoms, and according to some insiders, her initial coroner report labeled her death a homicide before it was quietly revised. Then there's Al B. Sure, another Uptown artist. He slipped into a coma shortly after teasing a documentary and only recently came out of it. That's for people. All tied to the same label, the same inner circle, and the same mogul. All either dead or nearly dead within just a few years. And all of them were either writing, preparing to speak out, or re-emerging publicly. When you lay it all out like that, it's hard not to ask, what really happened to Heavy D? This wasn't just another celebrity tragedy. This was a man who had reinvented himself. He'd cleaned up his life, lost over 135 pounds, became a father, stepped into executive roles, and started turning down toxic industry deals even when the money was good. He was careful, selective, focused, and then, suddenly, he was gone, face down on a walkway, just 44 years old. After a successful show, with no history of drug abuse, no public health issues, no visible signs of anything wrong, even to the people closest to him. The official report says it was just his body failing him. But the whispers from insiders say it might have been something else entirely. And once Jaguar Wright spoke out, those whispers, they turned into fire. As soon as news of Heavy D's death broke, the media rushed to explain it away. A pulmonary embolism, they said. A random blood clot caused by a long flight. But the public wasn't buying it. Because when someone dies that suddenly, that young, With so much left unfinished, people start asking questions, and those questions came fast. The first wave of speculation. It focused on money, life insurance, financial motives. Some insiders whispered about undisclosed policies, big ones, and certain people who might have stood to gain a lot if Heavy D were no longer around. He had assets, royalty streams, a Beverly Hills condo, and, maybe most importantly, power, not just as a hip-hop legend, but as an executive. The kind of executive who knew where the bodies were buried. Then the rumors turned darker. Some believed Heavy D had been poisoned, that the clot wasn't natural, that someone tampered with his system, slipped something into his body that mimicked natural symptoms, but left no trace. Jaguar Wright wasn't the only one hinting at this theory, but she was the loudest. And she made one thing clear. People like Heavy D don't die like that, not without help. Not when they're about to publish books. Not when they're preparing to expose the truth.
You know, they have poisons that create heart attack and pneumonia-like symptoms.
Then came the smear campaigns, the rumors that Heavy D had overdosed, that he collapsed from a hidden addiction. But when the toxicology report came back, no narcotics, no alcohol, no illegal substances, only a trace of over-the-counter cough syrup, nothing to support those claims. Still, the whispers lingered. Others pointed to medical negligence, that when Heavy D collapsed outside his home, help didn't arrive fast enough, that emergency services were delayed, that the care he received both before and after the collapse wasn't up to standard. There was never a full investigation into the response timeline, but stack that on top of everything else, and the smoke only gets thicker. Then came the psychological theories: stress, pressure, burnout. Some claimed Heavy D had been pushed too far. His return to music, his unfinished book, his behind-the-scenes power moves, all of it, they said, had taken a toll. The smile he wore on stage, just a mask, hiding the exhaustion, and the very industry he helped build, now working against him. Then came another theory altogether: gang ties, street retaliation. That maybe, just maybe, Heavy D had reconnected with people from his past. People who didn't want to see him rise again. People who felt abandoned, betrayed, or silenced. And lastly, the hidden health theory. That Heavy D had been secretly battling a condition, that he or his family knew something was wrong but chose not to speak. Maybe out of pride, maybe out of fear, or maybe because he understood that once the industry smells weakness, they pounce. But what truly pushed these theories into overdrive was the pattern. Because Heavy D wasn't alone. He wasn't the only one tied to Uptown Records who died mysteriously. He wasn't the only one close to Diddy who passed away suddenly. And he wasn't the only one working on a tell-all book. When you zoom out, the coincidences stop feeling like coincidences.
He must be the luckiest motherfucker, because it seems like everybody that worked at Uptown Records from the very beginning.
Heavy D, Kim Porter, Andre Harrell, I'll Be Sure, nearly gone. All connected, all tied to the same label, the same legacy, and the same man who still walks free. So what was it? The music industry? A streak of bad luck? Or something deeper, darker, and intentional? Because from this point forward, it gets a lot harder to ignore the elephant in the room, Diddy. And that's exactly where we're going next. It's impossible to talk about Heavy D's death without mentioning Diddy. Not just because they worked together, not just because they both came up under Uptown Records, but because every time someone close to Diddy dies suddenly, his name always comes up, and that's not just speculation. Let's start with the facts. Heavy D wasn't just another artist signed to Uptown. He was part of the foundation, one of the originals, a key reason the label had credibility and crossover appeal in the late 80s and early 90s. He wasn't just talent, he had influence. He helped shape the sound, the look, and the power of the label. And when Andre Harrell gave a young intern, named Sean Combs, a shot at Uptown in the early 90s, it was Heavy D who reportedly vouched for him. Without Heavy D, there might not be a Diddy. That's how deep the roots go. But what happens when the student becomes the master? Over time, Diddy's rise came at the expense of a lot of people who gave him opportunities, people who didn't always agree with how he moved once he had power. And while many of those people faded into the background, Diddy kept climbing. Bigger, richer, more untouchable than ever. And that's why, now, people are starting to ask, why do so many people around him keep dying? Jaguar Wright didn't hold back. She laid it out plainly. Heavy D was working on a Tello book. Andre Harrell was working on a Tello book. Kim Porter was working on a Tello book. All three got null under mysterious circumstances. Even Al Bashir, who had just started filming a documentary about his life, suddenly slipped into a coma in 2022, out of nowhere, and yes, he too was connected to Diddy. Now, it's true Heavy D and Diddy had drifted apart in their later years, but it's also true that they had unfinished business, both personal and professional, in the final stretch of his life. Heavy D had chosen independence. He launched his own label, took full creative control, walked away from major record deals, the lucrative ones. Word in the industry was, he was done playing the game, and in a world where control is currency, that kind of separation, that kind of freedom, can be dangerous.